Go.
Welcome to the Willamette Women Democrats. I am Veronica Williams, and I have the honor of serving as the president of W2D. We are in our 23rd year of presenting outstanding speakers and programs. We are truly the place where the biggest names discuss the biggest issues affecting Oregon and the nation. This year, we have heard from Senator Jeff Merkley on the issues at stake in the 2020 election, from Oregon State Senator Lou Frederick and the newly elected Multnomah County District Attorney Mike Schmidt on the path forward in Oregon for criminal justice reform. And today it will be election 2020. If you are a past member who is not renewed or a first-time guest, I encourage you to go to our website and join W2D to ensure you receive notice of our upcoming programs. I'm going to let our guest address our recent election, but I will say that despite the behavior of our current president and his enablers, there is a sense of calm creeping across this country and a rising hope that the adults are back in charge and we can move forward on a number of pressing issues. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Murray, who is the chair of our program committee, and she will introduce our guest today. Nancy?
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome back Professor Jim Moore. We are fortunate to have an experienced analyst of politics who's comfortable wearing two hats. First, as a professor of political science at Pacific University. Equally important, he is a public explainer who answers the media's frequent calls to help journalists and the general public alike understand through a politically neutral voice why we got the outcomes we did. One of the reasons he continues to be called on so frequently is his ability to communicate with his audience. He's direct, will tell us the most important things first, and tell it in bite-sized pieces so we can retain what we hear. Professor Moore has traveled widely, reads history, speaks several languages, and teaches courses in US foreign policy and international political economy. He studies reporting on many topics for its political ramifications, giving him ample understanding of the issues to provide context to his analyses. In addition to all the work I've just cited, he finds time also to be director of political outreach for the Tom McCall Center for Civic Engagement, providing Pacific University students with experiential learning in civic life. He's also writing a book about former Governor Vic Atiyeh. Besides figuratively wearing two hats, Jim for his signature bow ties. I read that while answering questions about the 2016 election on Coin TV, a viewer suggested that Jim's tie was a clip-on. As Business Weekly described it, he looked at the camera with a wry smile, untied the bow with a flick of his wrist, and retied a perfect knot before moving on to the topic of third-party candidates. I say bravo. So I present a man of many talents by asking the question of this election, what just happened?
Yeah, great introduction. What did just happen? So later on, if we get in the questions, I'll do the tie thing. I just did it for K2, but we had to do everything because Joe Biden was acknowledged as the president-elect, so we had to re-record. So it's good to see so many of your names here and a couple of faces. This is a nice familiar group. What I'm going to do today is I have some slides and we'll go through them. And then we're going to take a brief break at 5 o'clock and winners are going to be announced and all sorts of things like that. And then we're going to go to questions after that. Okay, so that's kind of the order of things. And so I shall now go to the slides. There we go. What just happened? A guide to one of the most contentious elections in decades. So here we are with the presidential race. As of about more or less 2 hours ago, Biden is ahead by over 5 million votes. Just as a comparison, when Barack Obama won the presidency over John McCain, he won by 9.5 million votes. So we're getting into some serious territory here in terms of the actual lead. We're not quite sure how many votes are still out there to be counted. Originally, people, and I was included, were kind of guessing, saying, well, we might get 150 million. Previous record was 4 years ago, about 138 million voters. Now we might be at 160 million, so we might be almost done, or we might have 10 million to go in terms of the ballots that are still out there. Electoral College, Biden's at 279. ABC has called Arizona, so hey, they have him at 290. But it will probably go to 306. The thing in the brackets there, my guess was that Biden would be 279 to 334. So I'm right in there in the middle of my range. Trump's at 217 right now with North Carolina. He will go to 232. So none of that is incredibly remarkable. It's just that how close so many of the races were in so many of the states. Let's look at Oregon. So in Oregon, Biden wins 56.5% of the vote, Trump 40.3% of the vote. And you'll get some comparisons a little bit later on about how that is for kind of generic Republicans and Democrats in the state. I'm a student of all things political in Oregon. So I actually have a list that has all 41 presidential elections and what the margin of victory was and everything else on it. So I can tell you that this victory is number 13 out of 41 in terms of the size of the victory. It's right between Obama's 2008 victory. And if anybody remembers William McKinley beating William Jennings Bryan in 1900, there you go. That's number 14. The two closest ones were 2000 when Al Gore beat George Bush by 0.5 percentage point. And then those of you who remember the 1976 election, Gerald Ford beat Jimmy Carter here by 0.2%. So those are the really close ones. Oregon continues its Democratic victories for the presidency. This is number 9. If we keep going, and there's no reason to expect we will not in 2024, we will tie the longest straight support of a party that we've seen. The Republicans had 10 straight in 1872 to 1908. So that's kind of where we are. Oregon's clearly becoming more Democratic over time at the state level. Now let's look at some interesting ways of looking at this. So here's Washington County. Clackamas County will be next. In 2000, in Washington County, Gore edges out Bush by 2 percentage points. This time, Biden beats Trump 65 to 31%. That's a significant change in 20 years. That comparison with Multnomah County, look at that, 2000, 64-28 sounds an awful lot like 65-31 right now. Washington County, and we saw this in 2018 with the results, Washington County is now as Democratic and looking as Democratic as Multnomah County was 20 years ago. Now, I don't know if that means that we'll go towards Multnomah County, which this time Biden won with about 78-79% of the vote. I don't know if we'll continue that, but a significant change. And we'll talk about that when we look at some of the local races as well. Clackamas County, 2000, Gore lost to Bush by less than a percentage point. Here we are, 2020, Biden beats Trump handily by 11%. So Clackamas County is also, and we've once again been seeing this at all sorts of levels, Clackamas County is moving more firmly into that Democratic column. Federal races. Not much to talk about here. Remember, 6 years ago, we were talking about Monica Webby taking on Jeff Merkley and all the things about that. None of that this time. And so the Senate race goes to Merkley. In Suzanne Bonamici wins easily. Earl Blumenauer wins easily. Kurt Schrader wins easily. The Republican seat, kind of designated Republican seat in the 2nd Congressional District, Cliff Bentz easily wins his first term. CD4, Peter DeFazio, that was pretty interesting. He actually had to work this time. And he did. And, you know, I've been living here since 1990. I've been following Oregon politics for over 50 years. And looking at history for before that, I can't remember a time when the 4th Congressional District advertised in the Portland metro market. but we certainly had a lot of those ads going on for Alex Skarlatos and Peter DeFazio. Some of them funny, some of them kind of weird, but DeFazio wins. Important because the US House stays in Democratic hands, diminished a bit. So DeFazio continues to be the powerful chairman of the main committee that deals with infrastructure projects. That's one of the chief ways in which you get out of economic situations that we're in right now. So Peter DeFazio will be a very important person in Washington, D.C. Coming up this next Congress. Statewide office, reversion to the status quo. You will all, of course, remember that Dennis Richardson, the Republican, beat Brad Avakian 4 years ago. Shemia Fagan, I said it wrong again. No, that is right. Shemia, I said that wrong on television on election night, and I got flustered. And lo and behold, Shemia sent me an email, which was actually really funny. And we had a nice talk on the phone a couple of days later. But I just have to not concentrate on how to pronounce her name. So she takes the Secretary of State back into Democratic hands. Owen Rosenblum wins easily. Tobias Reed wins election. I see Jeff is in the audience. You know, Jeff came really close 4 years ago, losing just by 2.4%. This time, kind of a reversion back to the mean. He loses by 10.3%. Tobias Reed is in there. Here's the key thing. Republicans averaged 42% of the vote. And I've talked about this with you before. Republicans have a real hard time in this state getting above 40, 41, 42%. And if there's a strong campaign like Newt Bueller we saw 2 years ago, and to a certain extent Kim Thatcher this time, then they might get to 43, 43 and a half, maybe 44. But there's just a ceiling that Republicans can't break through at this point. The Democrats averaged 52.7% of the vote. Notice the presidential stuff at the bottom there. Biden did better than the Democratic average. Trump did worse than the Democratic average. So that's one thing I'll be looking at when we get the final numbers to really drill down. You know, it's not much a difference between 40.4% and 42%, but does that mean that in certain parts of the state, Republicans were deserting the president and going over to Biden? We'll look and see if that was what was going on, which would be a very interesting finding. The ballot measures, none of them had any big problems. The main thing was the tobacco tax that passed overwhelmingly. In California, they had almost exactly the same tobacco tax. The people who were in favor of it raised tens of millions of dollars. And then Big Tobacco came and spent $70 million to defeat it. And it passed more or less by these numbers. So here in Oregon, here in 2020, the people who wanted the nicotine tax for health programs raised $14 million, which for us is a lot of money. Most of it came from the Kaisers and Peace Healths and Providences of the world. And then Big Tobacco didn't show up. So they spent all the money. I checked the Orstar money stuff there, and they did spend the money, but it ended up not being a really hard-fought election there. The big things that people are talking about around the world, I see this in my international sources, medical psilocybin, which is really interesting, but it's not unique. For instance, the city of Washington, D.C. voted to take advances in terms of psilocybin as well in this election. And then in the United States, big deal, decriminalizing hard drugs and using marijuana taxes for addiction services. This is big in the United States, but for instance, in Europe, there have been countries that have had decriminalized hard drugs for 35, 40 years at this point. So no big news to them, but kind of Oregon in the United States being on the cutting edge of these experiments, these changes, and we'll see how they work out. As a social scientist, I love this stuff because I love a good social experiment. They're so hard to put together, but we'll be able to measure it and see, so did it deal with the issues that come from addiction and things like that in a better way than what we had before? And the rest of the country will look and they'll say, oh, well, the laboratories of democracy, what the different states do, and they'll say, we want to do it or we don't want to do it. So we're once again kind of taking that medical line a little further than it has been in the past. Oregon legislature. So you're all familiar with this. We get out of the Senate, just was 18 Democrats and 12 Republicans. And guess what? It's going to probably end up 18 Democrats and 12 Republicans. Republicans picked up a seat on the coast. And this was not unexpected. Arnie Roeblen held that seat, and he just won by a few hundred votes 4 years ago. So it was right for the Republicans to take it. I have Dick Anderson, Pacific 72. He called me the day after the election, and I've never met him before, but he called and said, I've wanted to do this ever since I decided to run. I want Pacific students to come and be interns in my office. It's like, Dick, you're on. So we'll get that going. And then Democrats, I saw Deb Patterson in there. Looks like she is going to take that seat from Denise Bowles. So that's a pickup there. And then the one that was kind of the pivot was Tim Knope in Bend. He was ahead late into election night, and then it switched in the night, or he was behind, and then it switched in the night. So he's ahead by, last I saw, about 1,400 votes. So he will win that race. So here's an interesting thing down at the bottom here. And we'll get to this. I've got some cool graphs for you. In this election, Democrats voted at a higher rate from the get-go. And then I kept waiting for the Republicans to catch up, and the data that we have only goes to the day before the election. It doesn't have election day yet. And the reason this is important is usually Republicans and Democrats are vastly higher percentages of them are voting in elections. For instance, if Republicans are at 85%, Democrats will be at 83% in terms of turnout, but Republicans are always just a little bit ahead. So they're both far ahead of the minor parties and certainly ahead of the unaffiliated, but the Republicans are always a little ahead, and the Republicans were behind basically through this entire process in turning in their ballots. Now, when we got the ballots that came in on election day, it didn't change things statewide, but it did change things in certain Senate districts, and you'll see there's a couple of House districts as well. So when we get the final numbers, I'm going to be going back, and you can look and see, I've got all the data from day by day by day. I'll look and say, okay, so what was going on in Marion County? Was there a big push there where Republicans voted at a higher rate on the last day and may have caught up with Democrats? So that kind of thing is interesting, and it kind of changes the recipe that you use when you're running for office about how you look at your voters and who you're trying to motivate and things like that when the parties are acting in a different way than they have in the past. Oregon House, once again, we're at 38-22 right now. Just a little historical tidbit there. 38 is the highest for any caucus since 1955. It's happened 4 times. Republicans twice in the 60s, Democrats 75. Vera Katz was the speaker then. And then this one right here. I don't know why 38 is the limit. In the Senate, there have been several times when the majority party has absolutely wiped out the minority party. In my Vicatia book, and those of you with long memories will remember this, there was a time when there were only 6 Republicans in the Oregon Senate. And a photographer from Klamath Falls said, you know, it'd be a great picture if I could get all of you to get in a phone booth in the legislature. So on the second floor in the balcony there's 2 phone booths right next to each other. All 6 of these not small men are crammed in there, and it's a famous picture. But we've never had that kind of real dominance in the House. And so we went backwards. So the Democrats continue 37-28 or 37-23, still have the supermajority. So if there's any taxes, if they could hold the caucus together, they're fine. Still have a large majority there. The Republicans flipped to the coastal kind of south central and north. And once again, not that big a surprise, especially in the north. Tiffany Mitchell, who held that seat, was a very close race when she won it. The Democrats flipped the Bend seat, which has, I don't have the exact numbers, but the Republicans trailed the Democrats in registration by like 16% in that district. This is the one where the person who won it 2 years ago, it was because the Democrat was the person on the Bend City Council who'd been charged with harassment and all sorts of things and refused to quit. And so the Republicans won this time easily. The Democrats took the seat. So demographic reality asserted itself. The late breaking Republican surges this time, once again, not statewide, but House District 52, which is kind of Portland to Hood River. And House District 31, which is Washington County going up north of that. Democrats still have leads, but the leads were in the thousands before these last votes were turned in, and now they're in the hundreds. Once again, I don't expect them to change at this late date with the number of ballots that are still out there, but something, did, for instance, the Republicans only turn out at a bigger rate just in a few counties around the state, and why would that be is something that I'm going to be really interested in figuring out as we move forward. Washington County, the Beaverton vortex. There's a lot going on in Washington County, but this is the real story here. So go down to the bottom first. Beaverton in Washington County in the 1990s and 2000s. This is when Washington County was basically the center of Republican power in the state. Social conservatives were beating moderate conservatives. So Mary Alice Ford, for instance, a moderate, was being beaten by Eileen Kutub, who was a social conservative. And yet here we are 25 years later, and 4 progressive Democrats win in the Beaverton area: mayor, city council, county commission, and then Winsby Campos going to the Oregon legislature. A side note on Winsby, Pacific class of 17, one of my students. So I made sure that she and Dick Anderson get to know each other. There's just a 44-year difference in their ages. So what's remarkable about these? All women. 3 of them are women of color. Progressive politics coming to the heart of Beaverton. This is something that is something of a surprise, and yet none of them had particularly close races. So something's going on in Beaverton that's beginning to change the way that we're looking at things. Remember that piece of data I showed you about Multnomah County 20 years ago and its vote, in Washington County now, which are about the same? Could this be an indication that Washington County is going to become more like Portland, with the progressives having a real strong role? So this is looking at the ballot returns, daily ballot returns by party. This is just 2020. The blue is Democrats, the red is Republicans, the gray is unaffiliated, the green is other. And you can see, look, Democrats turning in at a higher rate all along there. And then finally on Monday before the election, day 12 the Republicans are beginning to pull up. So the question I got to figure out is, the Republicans equal, or as they have in the past, surpass the Democrats on that last day? My suspicion is statewide they didn't, but those counties and those legislative seats indicate in certain locales that they did. And so that'll be something I'm going to be looking at carefully. Once again, remember, the pattern usually is that the blue and the red are basically at the same level every single day as we go through the ballots coming in. This is daily ballot returns, percent of registered voters. So this is just presidential elections since we've had vote by mail. So from 2000 to 2020, the purple is us. The purple is 2020. And look, early on, we had much earlier ballot returns than we'd had in the past. And it turns out, as you know from watching the news, this was a national trend. This is going on across the country, and Democrats were the ones who were first out of the gate to get those ballots in. Now, as we see from the results, where the Congress basically didn't change very much, it may be that it's similar to Oregon, where the Republicans turned in their ballots at the end, and that's what kind of brought everything back to parity as we're moving forward. But we got to really examine the results and who turned out to really make that assessment. Notice that as you get to the far right there, day 12 election day, all of a sudden the percentages drop off, and we had the lowest number of ballots returned in our 20-year history of vote by mail on the Monday before election day and election day, the lowest that we've ever had. In some places, some years, that was 35–40% of the votes came in on election day, and the day before, like from 1 o'clock on. That was not the case this time. So people cast their votes early, stuck with it, and then the stragglers came in, but at much lower rates than they had in the past. So this is looking at actual numbers. Remember, we have a lot more voters because we have motor voter. So we have 2.9 million registered voters. And guess what? Even if those unaffiliated are voting at a rate that is 30 to 40% less than Republicans and Democrats, that's still a lot more voters. So here you can see the purple, us in 2020, we just kept going and going and going. By about day 7, day 6, I was doing daily things for the Channel 2 people about what the ballot returns were, because it was just so fascinating to watch this all develop. My prediction then was that we would go 2.4 to 2.5 million turnout. Right now we're 2.41 million, and there's supposed to be maybe 60,000 more votes out there. So that'd get us comfortably into the middle of 2.4. But whatever it is, it's nice to see that what looked like a trend went through, and my numbers were vaguely right. But that's just phenomenal. You know, the differences there are amazing. By day 9, so you can count backward. There's Tuesday of election day, Monday, day 11 is Friday, day 10 is Thursday, day 9 is the Wednesday before the election. By that day, more people had voted than voted in the entire 1978 election in which Vic Atiyeh first won the governorship. And we were still going at that point. So there's this is a real blow for democracy, just getting more people involved. I think it's great. Then a couple of last ones. This is the turnout from 1960 to 2020, looking just at presidential years, percent of registered voters. The line across the middle is 81%, which is the average from 1960 to 2016. Until we get the final percentage for this, I'm not going to add it in there. It's not going to change it much. But you can see in the early 60s, we're getting up above 85% sometimes, but 85-ish was kind of the norm. In the 70s, apparently we went to sleep for a while. And then we went back up 2004, but we're in a bit of a decline. And this is percentage of registered voters. Remember, since 2016 with Motor Voter, we've had a bigger pool. And so then this one shows you that bigger pool. This is the actual voters. And by gosh, things take off there in 2020. And there's a pretty big jump from 2012 to 2016 as well. So a lot more people taking part, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So as we're looking at this, you know, things to keep in mind. The biggest surprise to me in this election was how much the partisan balance of power didn't really change, both at the national level and at the state level. And it's not just looking at the Congress and looking at our legislature. People who look at this, and I read their stuff, I don't do the counting, people who look at every single state legislature in the country have looked at it, and this is the fewest state legislatures bodies, so the House or the Senate, that have changed party since the early 1920s. Only 3 of those bodies changed control this time. So for all the stuff about the Democrats saying there's going to be a blue wave or a tidal wave, and I was saying, you know, maybe a slow tide, it could be a tidal wave, you never know. But whatever it was, it didn't happen. And the Republicans, remember them, especially at the beginning of the summer, they were looking out there saying, you know what, we can take back the House. We can take back the US House of Representatives. And that didn't happen either. They certainly made gains, but they don't take it back. They don't take it back. So remarkable for all of this, with Trump's personality, with people just so committed to this election and what was going on here, we end up with kind of where we started. The presidency will be different. We will have Joe Biden as the president, but the Congress is going to be basically split in more or less the same way. Well, if you get into that in the questions, we can talk about Georgia, but the odds are against the Democrats picking up the Georgia Senate seats. It could happen, but the odds are against them. And then the Oregon legislature, we kind of end up with the same thing that we have as well. So it's the same splits. You know, there, even especially in Washington County, Clackamas County, if there were new faces that came in, they came in and the same party won. So it's remarkable how little change there was. Some new faces in there, but the partisan balance stays basically the same. So we'll stop there and go to the announcements part and then come back for questions.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. I may not have everybody, so we do have a few people in the room that I just want to especially call out. State Rep Margaret Doherty is with us, and always a delight to have her. We hope that you will continue to come back after your January retirement and join us and share your thoughts on different topics as they come up that are of interest to you. So thank you very much, Margaret, for joining us. Jim mentioned we do have Deb Patterson, who I am hoping is Senator-elect Deb Patterson for the Salem area. Many of you were with us when we hosted an event to raise funds for Shamia Fagan and Deb Patterson, and the third person who is with us today, who is Garrett Rosenthal, who won his race for Metro. So we were very pleased. We had a great fundraiser. We were able to contribute to all of their campaigns, and on all three of them won. So I think we did a great job, and we're very happy about that. I'm not sure if I missed anyone. If I missed you, if you would put a note in the chat, then I would be glad to recognize any electeds or ones soon to be. So with that, I will give it back to Jim. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, questions, put them in the chat and we'll get to them. This is from Sandy. Attribute the sameness of the results to gerrymandering, or that more R's voted down ballot than D's. You know, in many states, you can attribute it to gerrymandering. Here in Oregon, I know more about Oregon and Washington. I don't think it is. I think it's the demographic changes underneath are kind of asserting things. And remember, in terms of gerrymandering, in terms of districts, remember, this is the last cycle that has these district boundaries. We've got the new census. God knows we actually counted everybody for the census, but we've got the new census. And so every state is going to be adjusting those boundaries. And the Republican Party's in deep trouble in Oregon because there are just fewer of them. And so the boundaries are going to reflect that. And it's going to be tough for them. You know, good for the Democrats, but tough for them. The idea that more people voted Republican down ballot, actually, we find exactly the reverse, but I'll be looking carefully at it. Many of you know there's a concept called the undervote. So the number of people who are registered and actually vote, then the number of people who vote for the most popular contest, in this case, the presidency, and then you go down for US Senate, you know, statewide things. And by the time we get down to state legislative districts or you know, to things like Metro or a city council, the number of voters has drastically reduced from the number of those same voters in a city, for instance, that would have cast ballots for the presidency. And in Oregon, when we've seen the undervote, it's actually been pretty equal across the parties. So I'll look at it. That, for instance, could be an explanation for why those Republicans closed up those races in those Senate and House races here in Oregon. So basically, I don't think gerrymandering had much to do with it in Oregon. Nationally, though, when you look at a place like Texas, yeah, they love the gerrymander there. Here, the minority party is cranky about it, but we actually do a pretty good job at it. And Shamia Fagan has actually come out and said she would like an independent commission of some kind to do it so that it isn't partisan. And so we'll see how far that advances. Remember, this is one of the things that did not make the ballot. Common Cause wanted something like this on the ballot, and it didn't make the ballot. Deb, well, you're welcome. There you go. I think you're going to win. I just read something where the Republican people here in the party say, no, you're not going to win. It looks to me like you're going to win. So Karen Packer, were all the losses on the coast open seats? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And the other seat was held by, I just spaced on it, but it was an open seat. Was it Caddy McCown?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Caddy McCown. So yeah, they were held by Democrats who, for various and sundry reasons, did not run again. And all of them were close races 2 years ago or 4 years ago. This time the Republicans got them. So one thing I'm going to be paying attention to, Timber Unity is out there. And Timber Unity, as far as I can tell, has not made a huge difference, but it could have in those two coastal races. There are lots of Timber Unity signs, especially up around Tillamook and there. But it takes more than signs to get people to vote. And so I'll really be breaking that down to figure out what was going on there. And it may be that it was just that people were ready for a change, which certainly happens. But we'll see what happens with that. And then Debbie Lindgren, what about quorum for the 2021 state legislature? It's the same. The Democrats in their wild dreams were saying, you know, we could get quorum proof majorities. And as I was looking at these seats, it's like, you know, those coastal seats look pretty vulnerable for the House. And in the Senate, it looked like there might be a trade-off. And you might get Tim Knopp, but then you're only up to 19. So no quorum proof majorities. But this raises a real interesting dynamic. The Republicans clearly have not really increased their strength. They don't have the ability to change any of the major bills the Democrats want to put through. And the walkouts worked for them. They prevented those bills from going through, especially cap and trade. And the Republicans who did that did not get punished by the voters. The voters basically said, we want you back in there. So the Republicans have a real strong message. Their supporters don't care if they walk out. So that'll be a just fascinating dynamic to see how that works. There will be new leadership in the Senate for the Republicans. So we'll see if that changes the dynamic or anything. But it's going to be an interesting ride as we move forward. Let's see here. Debs, who does note in Oregon? So I don't know what that means.
Who does not vote?
Oh, who does not vote? There we go. Excellent. So who does not vote? First of all, unaffiliated people don't vote. It's, you know, you don't remember the details of it, but by the day before the election, only about 55% of unaffiliated people had voted, as compared to way in the 80s for the Democrats and getting into the 80s for the Republicans. And the final numbers will bear that out. It's pretty consistent. So what does this mean? Remember, voting itself in the United States, because you have to actually go do it, is a measure of political participation. So people who tend to register on their own tend to want to vote at some time. When we do DMV, you're not making that choice. It just happens for you. And the unaffiliated voters, most of them are from the DMV registration in the past 4 years. Most of them are from the DMV registration, and we're seeing that they care less about taking part. So either party that can figure out how to get to those unaffiliated voters and get them to vote, geez, maybe up to 60% or something, can really change the dynamic of what goes on in this state. But right now it's clear, and the independent party would argue with me. The independent party makes the argument that if you add them together, about 4% of the voters, and the unaffiliated, you have the biggest political party in the state. It's like, well, except for the fact the unaffiliateds aren't a political party. Sure. But if somebody can figure out if there's anything in common with the unaffiliated voters, an axis that would make them go one way or another on issues of supporting candidates, there will be a real big change in what happens here in Oregon. Clackamas County Commissioner race, that one I didn't pay that much attention to. I mean, I know it's close, but I don't really have details on that. Sorry about that. Unaffiliated voters, we saw that Washington and Clackamas County, same impact that they have everywhere else. Now remember, with the unaffiliated voters, and this election so far has been exactly the same pattern in a given district. That can be the state, it can be a congressional district, it can be a House district, it can be a city council race. In a given district, there will be Democrats and Republicans. And lo and behold, the unaffiliated voters tend to vote in the same percentages for Democrats or Republicans as the registration. So in a Republican district in Southern Oregon, for instance, the unaffiliated voters will break for Republican candidates at about the same percentage as the difference between Democrats and Republicans. So we continue to see that. I haven't seen anything to suggest that that's changing. That says to me, and I think I've talked about this with you before, that we've seen a national research on this. Most unaffiliated voters are not really unaffiliated voters. They simply don't want to be associated with the name of Republican or Democrat. Maybe something ticked them off. Maybe there was a candidate they didn't like. But when it comes to it, they still vote for the Democrats or still vote for the Republicans. And given the way our self-selection works and where we live and things like that, that means that we get this phenomena where the unaffiliateds are breaking in about the same percentages for the Republicans and Democrats as the districts that they live in. Okay, what do you expect to happen in Oregon with redistricting? Lots of good fun. So we're supposed to get a 6th congressional seat. It's been since 1980 since we got another congressional seat. And so I was given the opportunity to play around with software. So where's the 6th congressional seat going to go? And it's totally up to the legislature, and then the governor signs off on it. And remember, for the congressional seats, if there's an argument, if they can't come up with a deal, then it goes to a federal judge who will draw the districts. There's a perfect sized new congressional district that is the non-Multnomah County part of Metro. If you look at Washington County and Clackamas County and the populations there, boom, there's your population, there's a new seat right there. It, of course, will have big implications, especially for the 1st congressional district. Does the new one become the 1st congressional district? Is the first now is something that's out of Metro going up kind of the same ways that it goes up to the coast and down the coast, that kind of thing? We'll wait and see. And that they may not even draw it like that, but it just sits out there and just calls out to be its own congressional district. So that'll link Washington and Clackamas County in a congressional district, which would be just fascinating. If that is what happens, then you have issues with balancing, and it all works out except for one problem. So for instance, it would make sense, like in our 2nd congressional district, which is north to south, the entire height of the state, basically. Washington has a lot of districts like that, Washington state. So it would make sense, for instance, to have a coastal district that goes from north of Portland up around the pommel of the horse of Oregon and down to Brookings, and then goes over and grabs Grants Pass or something like that. Resources would be, resource economy would be an important part. There'd be a unity of that kind of thing. So that would make sense. But the big problem becomes the Medford area. There's just too many people who live there. So I grew up in Medford. Medford has flipped between being with the Eastern Oregon District or the Eugene District. And it never is enough, except with a couple of exceptions, to actually have a member of Congress from Medford or the Medford area. It's always a Eugene person or it's an Eastern Oregon person. So Medford is kind of the odd person out there. For the state legislative districts, the big thing is there's been huge amounts of growth. And the growth has happened in Washington County, Clackamas County, Marion County, and Deschutes County kind of blows them all away. And so basically accommodating that growth and then trying to look at, see where the communities of interest are and things like that, that's going to be the really tricky part. I would expect the Portland area, especially the suburbs, to be gaining more districts, which is going to make the rest of the state really happy. But Bend is going to be kind of the toughest nut to really crack and figure out how to draw that and make it so it's relatively fair. But that's always good fun in these every 10-year things. So Ellen Smith, the electoral votes, the vote goes to the candidate who wins that state. Is that the norm or the law? It is the norm and the law. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the electoral college vote, I mean, the states, you have to figure out what to do with it. So every state has electoral college votes from 3 to 55. But what they do with them is up to them. So what they have decided basically across the board is 100% of their electoral college votes are going to go to the candidate for president who wins by a single vote in their state. And the reason they do that is because it concentrates the power of their electoral college votes more. Okay, so in Oregon, you saw, you know, it would be basically in Oregon with 7 electoral college. If we were going to basically split it up by proportional to Trump votes and Biden votes, it'd probably be 4 to 3 or 6 to 2, depending on kind of how we did the math. Or that'd be 5 to 2. So you can't have 7 get to 8 because that's bad math. So every state does that. There's some states play around with it. So Nebraska and Maine actually say there's 2 electoral college votes for the state, and then each congressional district gets its own electoral college votes. So in Maine, which voted for Biden, 1 congressional district voted for Trump. So there's a little blue or red circle there. And in Nebraska, which voted for Trump, there's a little blue circle that Biden got 1 congressional district. So that's every state is able to do that, figure it out, but they've decided to concentrate their power. I'm not sure that's a good thing, but I went and did the math a while ago, and it's really, even if you do it proportional, I was doing proportional like in 5 different presidential elections that were really close and big ones that were different. And the same person usually wins. Even in 2000, George W. Bush would have ended up as the president of the United States if we divided up proportionally by state. Ralph Nader would have gotten some electoral college votes, especially in Florida. Okay, Nancy Murray, what signals do you see that Portland City Council and the police department will or will not be able to make visible reforms before the nightly protests become even more entrenched? So visible reforms and effective reforms may be 2 different things. I don't see much evidence that they're going to be able to do it. Protests like the ones that have been going on in Portland tend to run out of steam after a while. And there have been protests that have gone on much longer than what we've had now. I don't know the exact number, but we're probably up to night 140 or something. And remember, they took off the time when the smoke was here. They didn't protest when the smoke was going on. It's a tough nut to crack. And part of it is the fault of the protesters. They speak with many voices. There is no leader. There's nobody for the city council to talk to about what the protesters want. So there's Black Lives Matter. There's the anti-capitalists. There are the very few people who are the anarchists. There's the Antifa, also a very, very small group. So there's the varied things, and there's not one voice. So it's hard to come up with, Portland City Council might say, here are some reforms. So that might, to a certain part of the protesters, say, yeah, that's what we want. And the other part will say, well, that's not what we want at all. In fact, it's irrelevant. So until there's a voice or even a little consortium of people from the protesters to talk to about what the protesters would see as acceptable or where we could move towards, I don't see much hope for change there. I just think the protesters will eventually get tired, but I have no idea if that's going to be when it really gets rainy and cold outside, which is what happened when Trump was elected 4 years ago, or if it's going to take something where the protesters in effect have to change, become more organized, something like that. It's a tough nut to crack when you've got a political conversation, but the other side of the conversation, in this case, the protesters, is amorphous, and it's hard to figure out what the conversation actually is on that side. Marilyn McWilliams, I mailed my ballot right after I got it. You're one of the reasons that those percentages were so high early on. Good for you. After 12 days, it had not arrived at the county elections office. They got you a new ballot. So this, I've heard this from a few people, but I haven't heard it any more than in the past. So this will be something else that we will be able to look at every county and figure out, so did you have more people like Maryland who were saying, my ballot hasn't got in, I need a replacement? We'll be able to actually go measure that. Remember, because of the post office, people around the state, and I was one of them, instead of saying get your ballot in the mail by Thursday before the election, we were all saying Tuesday before the election. And in other states, that's become one of the bones of contention about the Trump legal challenges to things that are going on in states. When did the ballots arrive? Could they arrive afterwards? You know, all those kinds of things, because the post office itself is become more sluggish. I know I put mine in the mail and it arrived at the county the next day. But we will, this is something we can actually look and see if Maryland's issue was a bigger issue than normal, in which case there's something we really need to investigate, or if she was just one of the unlucky ones where it just happened to happen this time. Yeah, the 70,000 vote undervote for Clackamas County Commissioner. Yes, it is shocking. I just did a piece that looked at the state results, and the main argument was that when you look at the state results, the state looks very red, and then there's these blue places up in the Willamette Valley and the coast, and then going over towards Bend. But when you dig deeper, you find some interesting things. So the #1 county that Donald Trump got the most votes in was Clackamas County. #2, Washington County. #3, Multnomah County. #4, Marion County. #5, Lane County, all of which strongly supported Biden for president. And then I looked at other things. So the statewide undervote. The undervote to Jeff Merkley's race was 50,000 statewide. Fewer people voted for Merkley's Senate race than they did for president. But when you got down to, Jeff Goodman running for treasurer, we're dealing with a difference of 110,000. 110,000, just for comparison, if you put together the 13 smallest counties in Oregon and the registered voters there, that's 112,000 people. So there's significant differences there. Clackamas County having a 70,000 undervote just for the county commissioner, there's something going on there. And we don't know what it is. It may be that the message that was there for county commissioner was not strong enough. It may be that people were getting tired as they went down the ballot. Remember the days when we had the ballots where we had like 21 ballot measures that we had to vote on? You've got 2 phone book size voters pamphlets. Boy, we noticed by the time you got down to ballot measure number 2021, there was an undervote. So this is something to investigate. Don't know why. And it may be from different parts of Clackamas County as well. It may be that people in Oregon City were conflicted because they wanted to vote to recall the mayor, but they couldn't do that until the next week. Who knows what was going on? But something like that is shocking and is something that we have to figure out what's going on. What can the Dems do to avoid walkouts? They can truthfully negotiate with the Republicans and take the Republicans into what's happening. My biography of Vic Attia, remember he was one of the people where there were 6 Republicans. He found he was very effective in committees, but he was taken seriously in the committees. But then there's the flip side of it. The Republican negotiations in the past legislative session basically consisted of, you have to pay attention to us because we're here and compromise is doing exactly what we want. That's not compromise. You don't have the majority. You've got to figure out what is in common with what the Democrats want. Where can you move forward? And the Republicans weren't doing that either. So it's going to take both sides to kind of grow up and figure out, do we want to figure out how to negotiate with each other? Or do we want to basically say there's a big majority of the Democrats and the only way to stop it is for the Republicans to leave? We'll see how that works. It's kind of a personality thing at the leadership level, but this is something where in the past, not in this last legislative session, but people may remember there have been little groups of legislators that have kind of broken off. And my favorite one is they had their secret meetings up in the dome of the Capitol. And they're coming up with different tax plans that are compromises across the parties or those kinds of things. So there may be room for something like that of people who aren't in the leadership to say, we just got to break through this. But it's going to take those conversations across the aisle. People are dug in right now. So this will be really fascinating to watch and see what happens. Is there any polling around unaffiliated voters? Not that I've seen. And when I looked at the exit polls, there's the national exit polls, and Oregon gets exit polls through the national stuff. No local people buy it, but CNN publishes them all, so I've got them all. They didn't even ask people about being unaffiliated voters. They didn't care. So we don't have good polling on that. This is my good friends at DHM. I may talk with them and say, look, we need to figure out what's happening here and see if we can dig in further on that. Will Oregon ever allow unaffiliated voters to vote in the primary elections? It's not Oregon, it's the political parties that make that decision. And both of them in the past have made a strategic decision to do it, and most of the time not to do it. So that's where the decision has to be made. So if you feel that's important, you here in the Democratic women here, your W2Ds, then you need to go to the Democratic Party and say, we've got to have this. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So it's up to the political parties to make that happen. So this is the kind of $64 one. What will happen if Trump doesn't leave the White House? Who gets to escort him out of there? So I think he's going to leave the White House. The cracks are beginning to happen in the Republican wall. But here's the thing to watch. If when the states certify their votes, which is basically going to start happening next week, but it'll take another couple of weeks after that. If when the states start certifying their votes, if the head of the GSA does not say, Joe Biden is the winner, here's the money, here you can start your transition officially, then we've got a serious problem. We have an absolute serious problem. Right now, it's an interesting problem, but it will become a serious problem if that happens. So at noon on January 20th, Eastern time, regardless of whether Trump has conceded, regardless of whether Biden has taken the oath of office, the presidency shifts to Joe Biden. It's just that simple. And so at that point, you know that there will be people who would say, Mr. Ex-President, it's time for you to leave. And if he doesn't, then the full power of the presidency is there for Joe Biden to move him on out. He will not want cameras there. He doesn't want to make this a perp walk. But there's other weird things that could happen. There's been rumors, and the what if scenarios have been delightful. Cover story in the New Yorker, cover story in the Atlantic, people on social media going nuts with this kind of stuff. Can Trump pardon himself? Untried. There's arguments for it and against it. So if he doesn't pardon himself, what could he do? So here's a scenario. He resigns the presidency 12 hours before the end of the presidency on January 19th. Mike Pence becomes the president and pardons him. So Donald Trump doesn't have to go through the embarrassment of having to walk out of the White House, under a cloud, or even have to show up at the party when the power shifts off to Joe Biden. Who knows? But I think things will resolve themselves more than not. Among other things, Trump is, the people around him are saying, Biden did win, and it's beginning to kind of sink in. Will he ever truly concede? Who knows? But remember, him conceding or Biden claiming victory doesn't matter at all. It's the state results that matter. And then the process of going to the electoral college in the states, having the Congress accept them, that kind of thing. It's those legal things that matter and determine who the president is. Who manages and begins the redistricting process? So in the legislature, they will appoint a committee. It generally tends to have a few from the Senate and a few from the House. And they sit down and they get the software out and they start drawing. When was it? Was it 10 years ago? I think it was 10 years ago. Yeah, Suzanne Bonamici was the member of the Senate. So she was the one who drew the districts, and she was with a Republican from the House. They drew the districts and everybody said it's fair. And in 2010, that was the first time in decades that the legislature passed the district redistricting and the governor signed it. Even when the governor and the legislature have been the same party before that, they've disagreed, and it goes in the state level to the Secretary of State and the federal level to the federal judge. So this basically, it'll be a committee that's appointed in the legislature, crossing both houses, and they'll put Republicans and Democrats on it, more Democrats than Republicans, I would imagine, and they'll start drawing and they'll figure things out. Nancy, should the US abandon the Electoral College? Yes, absolutely. No other country in the world has copied the Electoral College. But will it? No, we won't. And we won't because it protects small states. And Oregon is still considered a small state. Maybe when we go to 8 electoral colleges, we'll think we're in our, we're a big boy state now, but it protects the small states. It means that presidential elections have to pay attention to those small states in ways they would not otherwise have to have. But it makes no sense. I don't know what Biden's going to end up with, but he could easily win this election by 6 or 7 million votes. And to have it even in the possibility that Trump could have won the Electoral College with that big a difference just beggars the imagination. See, Claudia, does the lack of change at the state and local level mean the national vote was neither pro or anti-Trump? I think it was pro and anti-Trump, but I think it was in sections of the country. And it all kinds of balances out. And so that gets to, Georgia is going to be fascinating. It looks like Biden wins by, last I saw it was like 14,000 votes. So do those Senate seats, do they flip? That'll show something really important. Will they? It's tough because this was a huge turnout election. Will that many Georgians turn out for the special elections for the 2 Senate seats? The Republicans are hoping no, because they have a higher turnout in percentage terms. The Democrats are saying, yes, we can, because we're really motivated. Stacey Abrams is kind of the one who really is in charge of that huge Democratic turnout that had happened in Georgia. So, will that be before or against Trump? It will be, because the 2 Republicans candidates tied themselves closely to Trump, and the 2 Democrats said the big problem with them is they've tied themselves closely to Trump. So this election will take place, in a few weeks, but will Trump have in effect died down? Will Trump still be the center of political attention? that'll play a really big role in what we see. But yeah, the lack of change, national vote was either pro or anti-Trump. As a country, you can say absolutely. That's what it said.
So Jim, I'm
yeah.
gonna cut you off. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I know we have.
And we were just, there was just one breaking news down there. So cool. There we go.
So people can read the last little chat on there, but thank you so very much. We absolutely love having you come back every few years, and heavens knows this has been one of the more fascinating election seasons that we have seen in some time, and it is continuing to change and intrigue us. But I think as I have said to many people, this has been a bit of a time of a calm, so I appreciate that. I do want to make a couple of announcements. Our January program will be first order of business, an Oregon legislative review or preview, excuse me, and our invited speaker will be from the leadership of the House of Representatives in Oregon. So please join us second Thursday in January, and we will have the confirmed speaker available before we finalize that event, and we will let you know. I want to especially thank all of you who were involved in the recent election, whether you wrote postcards, made phone calls, sent letters, whatever. And I do want to remind you that there are opportunities to participate in the January 5th runoff in Georgia. W2D will pull together some things that are available and get that information out to people on our mail list so that you can find a way that's meaningful to you to help get out the vote in Georgia, because it clearly is important. And thank you all very much for attending, and we will see you on Zoom next year. Stay safe and happy holidays. Thank you all.